All right, so I'm just going to give just a few slides, and just to kind of get the conversation going on at least how I think about this problem. Um, Basically, the cost of raising a child recently is estimated around 230 something $1,000, and can we radically reduce the cost of raising a family in some sense? So, just to kind of level set, why are birth rates down, and how could we bring them back up? So, probably others have shown this. Certainly, others have seen this kind of reverse J-shaped curve. Birth rates being down across the industrialized world in general, as your income of a society or an individual increases, the fertility rate drops off. But then it kind of curves back up again once you get to like very high end, and then children become kind of a luxury. But it's like a slight curve up versus a sharp drop down. And that's been going on for some time. This is something going all the way back to like the 1800s. You've seen this sort of drop off as women in particular become wealthier and more educated, birth rates come down. Now, one reason for that, if you get into the micro, it's paradoxical. Wait a second, if people can, afford more things, why don't they have more children and so on? And one possible reason for that, and I should see if I can pull the numbers, but my hypothesis is that the price of children is rising faster than other things, and children become a luxury good. So the society as a whole becomes wealthier, and then the expectations and the cost of having a child rise. And so that's where that 233,000 figure comes. It's housing, it's food, it's childcare, and this doesn't even include, college tuition if you were to be so unfortunate as to send your child to college nowadays. But so this is one hypothesis. It's not the only thing. It's not just a cost thing. It's not purely economics, but I think it's part of the equation. And so, then we might ask, okay, how could this change? There's at least three broad classes of strategy. And I'll put them out there. And I think of them, I've got a framework from this book I wrote, The Network State, which I call God, State, and Network. And so, the question is, what do you think of as the most powerful force in the world? Is it Almighty God? Is it the U.S. military or the U.S. government or the centralized state? Or is it technology? Is it the decentralized network? Is it cryptography? And depending on how you think about things, you might have one of three strategies, or then maybe even combine them. So the first would be, God. So this is like the obvious thing, for a lot of religious conservatives, like Israelis or used to be Mormons. You have a community with a sense of purpose, a high TFR. And so Israelis have, it's a little bit hard to see there, but they just have fundamentally higher fertility by religiosity, but it's still above replacement even when excluding the ultra-Orthodox, okay? So that's, Israel, religious faith. The Mormons used to be cited as having a higher TFR and like having modernity and having a high TFR. But in recent years, it's really fallen off a cliff. And some people in the audience, maybe Mormons, this probably coincides with a degree of secularization of the population. So it shows that religious faith has to be maintained somehow in order for it to be correlated with high TFR, and that's difficult in a purely secular age. So this may be one piece of the puzzle, but it's not totally that easy to maintain on its own. What's the second piece? The second piece is the state, centralized incentives. So Hungary has a tax exemption where if a mother has 4 kids, you're tax exempt. And you can probably pencil out the math on this, where some fraction of people will have 4 kids, and those kids will produce more in sales tax and other kinds of taxes than they would consume. And so you can probably actually spreadsheet this out and say it's profitable. And something like this is actually big enough that it may actually be an incentive, because children are so expensive that you have to talk about a windfall level of incentive. China has actually been doing much more than people realize. It's not standing still. It's doing the 3-child policy. It's stopping 996, promoting traditional masculinity. It's subsidizing IVF. And, if you think about Cass Sunstein's nudge, well, in China it could become a shove, right? It's not simply, we're encouraging you to do this, but we're really telling you to do this and giving strong incentives. If you need a vaccine passport to go into a store or get in a bus, and all of that infrastructure was set up a few years ago, it's not inconceivable that a woman with 3 children or 4 children or 5 children or something like that sits at the front of the bus, or boards a plane first or something like that. That's the kind of thing China could just snap their fingers and roll out. Now, will that work? I don't know, but they're probably going to try stuff like that. And if it maybe there's a level of state coercion that perhaps combined with tax exemption gets you out of the ditch. So it's a combination of both coercion and incentivization. And Singapore's been doing this in a softer way, so-called baby bonuses. You get payouts and so on for having children, but it's not as much as like Hungary's tax exemption. That would be a much larger amount. But these are kind of state-focused things. And then the third category is network or technology. So techno-fertility. So I know that there's going to be people who are like, oh my God, I can't believe you're doing this. But I think this is actually a part of the puzzle, because there's a ton of different kinds of fertility technologies that are that could get funding, or that are being funded, that are being worked on. And so that's artificial wombs, for example. That's IVF and genetic screening. There's a ton of stuff in this broad area, and China's actually looking at doing something. It hasn't been reported very much, but one of the things that China does is it takes something that the West has gotten to work, and then they study the process and they take out all of the inefficiencies and they scale it up. And one of the big things they're looking at is scaling up IVF and making it something that's there for 1 to 2% of the population, into something that 10% or more can afford, like subsidized IVF across society. And they're basically saying, well, look, everybody should be able to have kids at a certain age, and it should be affordable, and the state will go really hard on fertility technology to make that possible. And I do think that if a society is actually embracing that, it's a very different thing if the state is throwing everything at it. So it's like a fusion of the state and the network. And so I think these are sort of these 3 possible angles, like the religious angle of build religious faith, the centralized state incentives, and then the techno-fertility, and probably some combination of those could get interesting. And there's much more I can say, but these are just some ideas, and maybe we'll need a fusion of them. Okay, so let me pause there and take any questions. Can you guys see me?
All right, yeah, I think I'll have to hand the mic over, and I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, so I think there's a generalization of the religion angle, which is mutualism, and community. It's another form of network, a way of reducing costs in terms of the child rearing, is having more, basically it takes the village to raise the child, so you have more communal housing, you have more like mutual aid, that kind of thing. So do you see that? Do you see a path for that?
Absolutely. And actually, if you, if there's a book I wrote called The Network State, you can see it at thenetworkstate.com. And one of the things that I'm writing about in a version 2 of it is, if you form a community online and you crowdfund some territory offline, you could set up something where you have, let's say you've got even 100 people. You could set up the entire community around, let's say, remote work plus child rearing. And so you have like a centralized childcare facility, maybe a gym alongside it, so adults can work out. And, maybe there's some karma system where you drop off your child and, let's say you've got 30 families. Each family has one day where they're looking after the other, people's children. And there's probably some sort of round robin set of incentives for having children, for taking care of them, and so on and so forth, where you've got essentially an extended family, trusted community, where you can look after their kids and they can look after yours. And that, once you have some economies of scale, it's not just about the money, but it's about the proximity and it's about the trust. You could probably radically reduce the cost of childcare and make it easier to raise your kid in an environment where the people share their values. So I do think that the community part is a big part of it.
So just to question your premise about the cost per child, what do you think
Sure.
about some of the twin studies that, like Brian Kaplan suggests, you can actually dramatically reduce cost per child and have similar outcomes?
Yeah, exactly. So that's something where it's hard to tease apart the causal relationship here. And it's one of those things though where when you ask people, a huge part of why, if you just there's kind of I'm a big fan of twin studies, a big fan of genetics and so on, but there's also just ask a 20-something or a 20-something couple and they say we can't afford kids, we can't afford a house, we can't afford to move out, and we'd want to do that, and so on and so forth. And are they all just preference falsifying? And they actually wouldn't have kids if they had more money. I don't know about that. So I don't have a full answer there, but my hunch is that at least part of it is related to cost. And maybe I'd have to you have to look at some of the genetic research to see if it's totally cost invariant, or maybe that's a background variable that varies over time, and the same genotype raised in different time periods would have different outcomes. I have to look at some of the data.
Hey, this is Razib Khan. I have a question for you. So you live in Singapore, and Lee Kuan Yew tried to incentivize larger families in Singapore, and that doesn't seem like it's worked. Does that show us that large urban areas just are not capable of having a pro-natalist policy that succeeds?
I don't know. So he may not have incentivized enough. And there's two ways of incentivizing. The first, like what Singapore has right now, is like a few $1,000s per kid or something like that. And that's not enough to, but what Hungary has with like a tax exemption after 4 kids, that now starts to get to windfall amounts of money. So that's like, if you're making a lot of money. So that's actually a different possible thing where the amount that you'd make, you actually might, I could imagine people actually focusing on that as part of a career building strategy. So he may not incentivize enough. That's one view. The other view is he may not have, the Chinese style is, to disincentivize. And it's not that you get a bonus, it's that a bonus is taken away. And so every Q in society, QU, EUE, you could, in theory, have people come to the front of the line, just like with vaccine passports. And this kind of thing is being talked about in China. If people have 3 children or more, and so I don't know. I think the Soviet Union actually passed a tax on childless mothers after the end of World War II, and it seems to have at least coincided with a baby birth. Now, in the Soviet Union, an income was something more like an allowance, so you can argue whether that was actually effective. But it just may be that they didn't push hard enough on the incentives, and it's within the window of just a few $1,000s doesn't move the needle, but hundreds of thousands of dollars or a lot of social status does. Don't know.
So you mentioned China, and most of the time China's talked about as like demographic collapse. I read a book this summer, I think it was called "The End
Sure.
of the World is Almost Near" by Peter Zine. He's like,
Yeah.
about China, like demographic collapse. But here you are coming out and saying no, that they are very much aggressively going after it with like a state level intervention approach. So
Right.
how much time has to go by until there's like a measurable response into something like this where it can see whether or not that level of policy is working? Is this like a 10-year?
I don't know. I mean, you'd start seeing birth rates pick up right away, if something was working. I think in general, like, I've got nothing against Zion, but I do think the stuff on demographics is kind of cope because, he's trying to say, Chinese demographics are terrible and American demographics are amazing because he's just looking at the youth or age pyramid. But if you look at drug overdoses or out of wedlock births or broken homes or life expectancy, or a variety of other measures related to ethnic and political polarization, the U.S. actually doing not so great. And China's only real problem is an important one, but one that they're dealing with in the context of like a 92% Han population and a totally unified state and so on. So on balance, I guess I don't know whether a secular state can solve this. Maybe they need to fuse it with Chinese nationalism, which is something else they're doing, right? So maybe some aspect of nation plus state could do it. Nation plus state plus technology. I just do know that the combination of going after 996, the 3-child policy, they went after school education, they bankrupted a bunch of, this is not the kind of thing I would do, or at least you certainly, you're kind of, eyes open with doing this. A lot of entrepreneurs didn't like it, but they went after school tutoring, they went after video games, they went after a variety of things that they thought were increasing the costs of, causing a family. Even housing, they've been trying to bring down the housing prices with the so-called 3 red lines. So I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I do know that they're trying. And so the view that they're just going to have a straight shot down is, I don't think that's right. At least they're gonna throw a lot at it. Anyway, they are throwing a lot at it. So, and we'll see if it works when we start looking at their birth rates or whatever. Of course, stats out of China are stats out of China. They reported like 0 COVID deaths for like a year or something like that if you look at their official numbers. But I think birth rates would probably pick up. Maybe they wouldn't fake that. We'll see.
Hey, so I'm not exactly sure how to ask this, but it feels like a lot of what underlies what we're talking about is not so much people having kids, but people having kids so that we can effectively continue to have pension schemes in the sense of, kids
The
cost,
Ponzi aspect, the Social Security aspect.
There's 8 billion people. If we don't stay at that number, it's a total disaster. And it's like, I'm not having kids so that I can have Social Security one day. Like, I'm having kids because I intrinsically want to have a family. And I feel like you're never going to gin people up to have kids so that we can have pension schemes work or financial and economic growth. So, like, is the real problem that we're not like, I guess I feel like we're almost dancing around the real problem. Is the real problem sort of built into the financial system, or is it that, hey, we just should be having more kids? Because I certainly agree with the latter, and I feel like the former problem can be dealt with in other ways.
Well, so several thoughts on that. First is Stanley Druckenmiller has written that the actual national debt is not 34 trillion, but something more like 200 trillion if you take into account all of the unfunded liabilities and pensions and so on, which means it's just massively bankrupt many times over and can never be paid. And moreover, if you look at the Social Security lockbox or what have you, they keep monkeying with it, but it's not like an actually siloed amount of money. And so I think you should assume that's insolvent, in my view. Or perhaps what'll happen is people will get devalued scrip to pay their nominal obligations, but it'll be defaulted on in purchasing power terms. So that's A. I don't think those obligations will be paid. B is one of the more, I think, like silly parts of, America has great demographics, is that the young in America are disproportionately immigrant populations, and they're supposed to be taxed, I think, to pay for the Social Security of the old, who are disproportionately Caucasian. And that's actually just a recipe for ethnic and economic polarization, where both sides feel a contract of some sort was broken. That's not yet a front page political issue, but it'll probably become one at some point. So and then the third is that I agree, you don't want to have children for the Ponzi of pensions. That's not a very inspiring thing. I think what we do need to do is we need to reopen the frontier. And that is historically the kind of thing where if you have elbow room, you will have a lot of kids. And, there's basically three, possible choices for that frontier. If you think about the land, the internet, sea, and space, we have 8 billion people on the land. We have 4 billion people now on the internet. We have about on the order of 1 million that are on the high seas, 100,000 to 1 million at any time, if you include cruise ships, tanker trailers, all that stuff. We have like on the order of 10 something that are in space, if you include the International Space Station. And so, what the Network State book is about is saying, okay, seasteading is cool and space is cool, and we want to open up those frontiers and make the oceans habitable, and we want to open up space. And Elon and others are working on that, and that's awesome, but those require some technological breakthroughs for space and coordination breakthroughs for getting the kind of cruise ships you'll need for seasteading, though you could probably just use crowdfunded cruise ships off the shelf if you had enough people. Intermediate to that is getting enough people together via the internet frontier, to go and crowdfund a Burning Man-like thing, meaning in the middle of nowhere, Black Rock City, it's like a barren desert, but you can just go and bring people there. That's a frontier of a different kind. Starlink has made much more of the map explorable. And so if you think about the internal frontier, where all of this land around the world that is underpriced is actually now more habitable thanks to, satellite internet, thanks to robotic construction, thanks to shipping containers and so on, you could have frontier towns. And then you have horizontal sprawl, which is much denounced, but actually good, rather than NIMBY, which is don't build at all, or YIMBY, which is build vertically and be constrained. You have HIMBY, horizontal in my backyard, where you're spreading out horizontally. And that's like what Burning Man, that's what the early towns and cities in the Midwest were like, where you just kind of went in there and settled, and you just got a plot of land and expanded horizontally. So that is, I think, a more inspiring kind of vision, is to reopen the frontier. And you start with these, crowdfunded cloud communities, and then you start bringing together those people with a pioneering spirit, and then you get to the sea, and eventually you get to space. And if you can get to space, we're going to need technology to get to space, then that's actually the real reason that you're going to need a lot of people, because it's a lot of people are going to die in space exploration, and there's a lot of planets out there.
Balaji, thank you so much for appearing for us, and wonderful to hear your thoughts. Everybody give a hand to Bob.